It begins with a simple act of trust. A small hand reaching out into the darkness, a stranger's smile, a piece of candy wrapped in bright colors, an ancient ritual of community and giving, played out on a million suburban doorsteps. But inside that colorful wrapper, a dark secret is waiting. A glint of polished steel, a razor's edge. It is a parent's worst nightmare, a treat twisted into a weapon, a story whispered every October, a shadow that falls over the most innocent of holidays. The story of the Halloween sadist. This is a tale of fear, media, and a myth that refuses to die. We search for the truth behind the legends that haunt our world. If you are drawn to the shadows where history and mystery intertwine, subscribe to our channel and share your own local fears in the comments below. You may discover they are all connected. Our story begins not in a haunted house, but on the manicured lawns of post-war America. It was a time of unprecedented prosperity, of baby booms and suburban dreams. A nation was rebuilding itself, brick by brick, family by family, and with it they were rebuilding their traditions. Halloween, once a rustic festival of harvest and spirits, was being domesticated, tamed. It was becoming a child's holiday. The wild, chaotic mischief of Mischief Night was smoothed over, replaced by a more orderly, commercialized ritual. Trick-or-treating. It was a perfect symbol of the era. Children dressed as cowboys and princesses could wander their neighborhoods, greeted by familiar faces, their bags filled with sweets. It was an expression of communal trust. A belief that behind every door was a neighbor, not a monster. But beneath this idyllic surface, a new kind of anxiety was taking root. The world was growing more complex, more uncertain. The Cold War cast a long nuclear shadow. Cities swelled, and with them, so did the crime rates reported on the nightly news. The old, tight-knit communities began to feel porous. The face of the person living next door was perhaps not as familiar as it once was. A seed of doubt had been planted in the American psyche, a suspicion that the safety of the front porch was just an illusion. And soon that seed would find fertile ground in the dark soil of Halloween night. The first whispers were quiet, almost dismissible. A local newspaper report here, a word-of-mouth warning there. In the 1950s, the stories weren't yet about razors or poison. They were about mean-spirited pranks, laxatives baked into cookies, bitter aloes smeared on candy. Unpleasant but not deadly. They were seen as what they were, isolated acts of cruelty or ill-conceived jokes. Then, in 1959, the narrative shifted. In Green Lawn, New York, a dentist named Helen Field grew tired of what she considered to be teenagers, too old for the tradition, coming to her door demanding treats. As a form of protest, she handed out packages of ant poison buttons clearly labeled with a skull and crossbones. Her intent, she claimed, was not to harm, but to make a statement, to scare them. No one was hurt. But the story made headlines. The image was potent, a treat handed out on Halloween that was actually poison. The idea had been introduced into the public consciousness. Throughout the 1960s, the anxiety simmered. It was the decade of assassinations, of riots, of a cultural fabric seeming to tear at the seams, and the media began to reflect this growing paranoia. In 1964, a frustrated housewife in Detroit handed out steel wool pads and dog biscuits. In New Jersey, a woman was arrested for handing out arsenic-laced candy. a charge that was later dropped when it was revealed to be a prank she played on her own husband. The incidents were rare and often not what they seemed, but the stories spread. They were amplified by a media landscape discovering the power of fear. A single unconfirmed report in one town could become a headline in another, and a nationwide warning by the next day. The faceless villain began to take shape, a Halloween sadist, a psychopath who took pleasure in harming innocent children, hiding in plain sight in a house just like yours. By the early 1970s, the simmer had become a rolling boil. The New York Times published an article in 1970 titled "Those Treats May Be Tricks," solidifying the threat in the nation's most respected newspaper. Popular advice columnists like Ann Landers and Dear Abby began printing letters from terrified parents, issuing dire warnings to check every single piece of candy. The myth had gone mainstream. The fear had tangible consequences. It began to change the very way the holiday was celebrated. Parents, once content to let their children roam free, now followed them from house to house, flashlights in hand. Hospitals across the country began offering free X-ray services to scan candy bags, a ritual of technological reassurance against a pre-modern fear. Many communities abandoned trick-or-treating altogether, opting for safe Halloween parties in church basements and school gymnasiums. The open door was closing. The trust was eroding. But what if the danger was a ghost? What if the Halloween sadist was nothing more than a fiction, a collective nightmare born of a nation's anxieties? Investigators and folklorists who have examined the period have found something startling. The vast majority of tampering reports from this era were hoaxes. Children, hearing the terrifying stories, would place a pin in their own candy bar to get attention. Or a parent, finding a slightly damaged wrapper, would jump to the worst possible conclusion. The evidence for a widespread campaign of terror by strangers was simply not there. The fear was real. The threat, it seemed, was not, until it was. October 31st, 1974. Deer Park, Texas, a quiet suburb of Houston. For the O'Bryan family, it was a typical Halloween night. Ronald Clark O'Bryan, an optician and church deacon, took his two children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, trick-or-treating with a neighbor and his kids. During their rounds in the rain, the group became separated for a moment. O'Bryan later rejoined them, holding 5 giant 22-inch pixie sticks. He claimed a resident from a darkened house had handed them to him at the end of the block. He gave one to Timothy, one to Elizabeth, one to his neighbor's child, and 2 others to children from his church. The city of Deer Park was plunged into terror. This was it. The nightmare made real. The Halloween sadist had come to their town. Police immediately launched a massive investigation, confiscating every piece of Halloween candy they could find. They discovered the other 4 pixie sticks that O'Bryan had distributed. They had been carefully opened at the top, laced with a fatal dose of potassium cyanide, and then resealed with a staple. A city held its breath, waiting to find out which of their neighbors was a monster. But as the police investigated, their suspicion began to turn away from the faceless stranger. They could find no one in the neighborhood who had been giving out giant pixie sticks. The story O'Bryan told didn't add up. Their focus shifted, and it landed on the grieving father himself, Ronald Clark O'Bryan. Investigators uncovered a dark secret in Ronald O'Bryan's life. He was over $100,000 in debt. He was on the verge of losing his job, his car, his house. He was a man drowning. And just months before that fateful Halloween, he had taken out substantial life insurance policies on both of his children. The truth was more horrific than any urban legend. There was no Halloween sadist. There was no monster hiding in the shadows of a stranger's home. The monster had been there all along, holding his son's hand. Ronald O'Bryan had poisoned the candy himself. He planned to kill his own children for the insurance money, using the pervasive myth of tainted treats as the perfect cover story. He even gave the poisoned candy to other children to make the act seem random, indiscriminate. It was only by a terrible twist of fate that his son Timothy was the only one to consume the poison that night. The media, which had spent years building the myth of the anonymous sadist, now had its poster child. But they had the story wrong. The case of Timothy O'Bryan didn't prove the legend was true. It exposed a far more intimate and perhaps more terrifying kind of evil. The crime wasn't stranger danger, it was filicide. But in the public imagination, the distinction was lost. The headline was simple: "Boy killed by poisoned Halloween candy." The myth now had a martyr. O'Bryan was dubbed the Candy Man, and his story became the ultimate cautionary tale, cementing the fear for generations to come. In the years that followed, a sociologist named Joel Best decided to do what no one else had: a systematic academic investigation. He wanted to find the truth behind the panic. He meticulously tracked down and analyzed every single reported incident of Halloween candy tampering reported by major news outlets between 1958 and the late 1980s. He was searching for the razor in the apple, the needle in the candy bar, the definitive case of a stranger murdering a child with a tainted treat. And after years of research, he made a shocking discovery. He found nothing, not one single confirmed case. The stories were almost exclusively pranks, hoaxes, or, in the rarest and most tragic of circumstances, crimes committed by a family member or acquaintance, like the O'Bryan case. The iconic image of the anonymous predator poisoning the innocent was a ghost. A modern folktale created and sustained not by fact but by fear. The great revelation of the razor in the apple myth isn't that evil people don't exist. It's that we have been looking for them in the wrong places. We built a narrative of danger from the outside, of a threat that comes from the stranger at the door. But the data shows a different, more disquieting truth. The real danger, statistically, has always been much, much closer to home. The myth of the Halloween sadist allowed society to project its anxieties outward, to create a simple monster to fear, rather than confronting the more complex and painful horrors that can exist within families and communities themselves. The legend persists. Every October, the warnings reappear on social media. The old fears are given new life. We continue to check the candy. We continue to tell the stories. The myth of the tainted treat has become as much a part of Halloween as ghosts and pumpkins. Why does it hold such power over us? Perhaps because it speaks to a fundamental human anxiety, the fear of the unknown, and the terrifying possibility that something wholesome can be corrupted. The candy is a symbol of innocence. The razor, a symbol of a cruel, senseless violence that can shatter that innocence without warning. In a world filled with complex, intangible threats, economic uncertainty, political division, environmental crises, the Halloween sadist offers a simple, tangible evil: a monster we can understand and one we feel we can protect our children from, with a flashlight and a careful inspection. The myth is a ritual. It is a way for a community to express its anxieties and reaffirm its commitment to protecting its most vulnerable. It is a modern folktale, passed down not by word of mouth around a campfire, but through news reports and Facebook posts. It reminds us that our world is not as safe as it seems, that danger can hide behind the most welcoming of masks. The razor and the apple may be a fabrication, a ghost story for the modern age, but the fear it represents is very real. It forces us to wonder, what new myths are we creating today to explain our current fears? And what uncomfortable truths about ourselves do they help us to avoid? Look closer at the stories you are told. The truth is always there, hiding in the shadows.